Hi everyone, my name is Katie, and today I will be discussing and analyzing gun violence using the multiple streams framework. So our textbook describes this framework as, quote, a lens perspective or framework that explains how policies are made by national governments under conditions of ambiguity. I think I'm pronouncing that right. In this case, ambiguity means that people have a wide array of understanding the same issue. So I like to think of it as like an individual project versus a group project. An individual project, you have your own way of doing something, you know how you're going to combat the issue, you know how you're going to attack it, you're good to go. And in a group project, there's a lot of different people at the table, obviously, and everyone they have their own ideas, and everyone thinks that their idea is good and correct and accurate, and that's okay. And it's just understanding that everyone has their own diverse way of thinking. And that's kind of how I thought about it when I was first reading. So gun violence is a great example of ambiguity because a lot of people disagree about the solutions to the problem and also how it started and what the underlying issue is. And so some people view it primarily as an access issue, access to firearms, while others believe it's contributing factors like mental health, lack of education, poverty, violence, family instability, a lot of things that we could help people with in order to prevent these issues. So because there isn't one universally accepted definition of the problem, various policymakers all over the country and world propose very different and dynamic solutions, and not everyone agrees with them, and that's okay. They're just ideas. Not everything works for everybody, but that's why we have a lot of things being implemented, and I'll get to that in just a sec. But the first part of our framework is the problem stream. So this is how, I've been talking all day, oh my gosh. This is how an issue gains public attention. So events like school shootings, mass shootings, a new release of data or statistics, or like homicides, suicides, media coverage, anything crazy in the news, that's the problem stream. And this is how it brings attention about gun violence and how the word spreads to encourage policymakers to take action. And this can flow into our policy stream, which is where different solutions come to the table, like in the group project, and they compete and they butt heads because not everyone can agree. But I don't think that we necessarily need to agree. I think that this is an issue where there are multiple things that we can do to combat this issue. So doing things like, I want to say background checks, but I feel like we're pretty good at that, but maybe just doing a little bit more. But background checks, safe storage, and this goes for everything. I think we're really doing all of these things really well, but I'll read my list. Background checks, safe storage laws, increased school security, community violence intervention programs, mental health support, public education on firearm safety. I think that's one that definitely could go out a lot more. Just like free classes to, understand all the firearm safety stuff. I won't go into it. But another thing is like increased school security. A lot of people think just like letting random strangers in the building. No, that's not what I think, honestly. If I were a principal or even a teacher, I would personally try to implement, like, I'm checking the kids' backpacks before they even come into the school, if that's a possibility. That's something that I would do. So when I say increased school security, I think the kids' backpacks, not necessarily the strangers, because the strangers, they'll lock you down and they'll pat you down like strangers are fine. But yeah, I just would say mainly the kids' backpacks and stuff. That's one thing that I would implement a little bit more. But there's also a huge talk about firearm regulation and the age at which you can get a firearm. I think that is a big issue, and it receives significant attention, but there are other things that we can be doing to prevent that. I'm all about prevention, and I think that preventing is like the biggest measure that you can take, because it's like when you get hurt, you know, obviously there's things that we can do during the situation, but it could have been avoided, right? So preventing is just my biggest thing. So now we can move into the politics stream, which focuses on how political priorities influence which policies are actually adopted. So elections, political parties, there's different political parties and people have different opinions, that's totally fine, but also public opinion, advocacy groups, state budgets even, they all affect policy making. And the policy stream, basically, it's just whether policymakers choose to support and fund what solutions they believe in. So there's a lot of things that play a role into what the policymakers decide is a good idea. So that's why advocacy groups, I think, are one of the biggest things. And so then this can flow into our policy window, which opens when all three of these streams come together. So major events, new public health data, changes in political leadership, they can all create opportunities for new legislation or policy changes. And then policy entrepreneurs, lawmakers, physicians, researchers, advocacy groups or organizations, even victims' families, they can all work to move their own preferred solution onto a public agenda. So it's honestly just keep pushing. I think that our country and our world is really good at pushing their opinion, and obviously no one has to agree, but with a situation like this, I think all ideas are great. So yeah, I had an example, but I feel like my video is already really long, but I think it's a really good example though. So I read an article from Giffords called Gun Law Trend Watch 2025, called The Year End Review by Lindsay Nichols, and it stated that Texas and 21 other states decided to spend state money on community violence intervention programs as part of their annual budgets. And Texas specifically allocated $2 million of taxpayer money for their CVI programs. And then the 21 other states chose to include similar funding and within their budgets that same year. So in 2025, a lot of the U.S. Used their taxpayer money on like gun violence intervention programs and stuff like that. And then on like a flip side, the same article stated that some states without red flag laws, which red flag laws are basically, it varies state by state, but basically if you go to court and a judge decides based on evidence that you are harmful to yourself or others, the judge can issue a red flag and it'll, I believe, go on your record or something like that, and you cannot own or purchase firearms for the safety of yourself and others. So that's what a red flag is, or red flag law. But red flag laws have gone even further to prevent their use and enforcement. Montana passed a law prohibiting local governments from enacting their own red flag ordinances or enforcing an extreme risk protection order against a Montana resident. And then Texas passed a similar law, but took it one step further and made it a felony to serve or enforce or attempt to serve or enforce an extreme risk protection order against another person or against a person in that state. That was a lot. That was a quote. That didn't make sense to me. So for example, if someone lives in Texas like myself, but they have connections in another state, a judge in the other state reviews evidence, decides that that person poses a serious risk to themselves or others, the red flag, they issue the red flag order and it temporarily removes that person's firearms. However, if a person is in Texas, Texas law enforcement cannot enforce that person because of the Texas SB 1362. So I wanted to include that reference as an example as to how there are multiple different ways of people deciding that this is a good idea of how we should fight against gun violence, and how we think that this will better the world or our state or our county, whatever. It just went to show a perspective, that there are multiple perspectives, and this is, one big group project, and we're all here to help. So yeah, that's what I learned. I think that this was a really great example, gun violence using the multiple streams framework. I had a really fun time understanding this, as sad as the issue is. I'm sorry that my video is so long, but I was like, I'm excited about this. I have a lot to talk about. So yeah, thanks for listening.